everyone. I'm going to kick off as we are at 5:30. And people are very welcome to join us as we go along. But welcome everyone, and a huge thank you for joining our first ever Big Tent digital event. And I want to firstly actually send our best wishes to the Prime Minister and his loved ones at this incredibly distressing time. And we will actually be keeping up with the news throughout, and will inform you all if anything urgent comes to our attention. But it looks as if things are going well, and Dominic Raab just said he is in good spirits. I have 5 brief housekeeping notes to go through before I introduce our superb speakers for this evening's event. So number 1, this session is being recorded and will be available to view in the members section of the Big Tent website, and it may also be used for promotional purposes. Number 2, on questions. If you would like to ask a question at any point during the discussion, then please type it into the chat box, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you send a question in the chat, I will then invite you to ask your question later in the session. And if you do not wish to ask yourself, then you can send it to me privately. If you click on the blue part that says everyone, you can find my name, Dolly, and you can send it to me privately, and I will read it out. And we will try to get through as many as possible. If you could please stay muted throughout the event unless you've been invited to ask your questions, so we don't have background noise. Hugely appreciated. And if it all gets too exciting and you are raring to continue the discussion after 6:30, then you may do so informally by staying on here for up to an hour afterwards. And this also may be recorded. So no swearing. No, you can chat about what you like. And finally, if the internet gods are against us this evening, and we have a wonderful backup chair to take over. And so without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our speakers for today. We are thrilled to have Big Tent's very own George Freeman MP with us. And recently, George was Minister of State for Transport. He was also previously Minister for Life Sciences in the Liberal Conservative coalition. He is former chair of the Number 10 Policy Board, author of Britain Beyond Brexit, and most importantly, founder of Big Tent. Thank you so much for joining us, George. We also have the superb Emily Benn with us. Emily is a political activist, to say the least. Former investment banker, former Labour Party parliamentary candidate in the 2010 and 2015 elections, and a former local councillor. She has just returned from a research position at the Harvard Kennedy School and is a keen supporter of Tent, and I promise I did not add that part in myself. Now I'm going to chair the discussion with George and Emily until about 6:10, and then we will move on to the Q&A with all of you before wrapping up at 6:30. And there is a lot to cover, so we will try and keep the discussion nice and tight. So I wanted to start with you, George, as you've been calling for a COVID coalition war cabinet, which sounds incredibly exciting and needed. So what exactly would this look like, and how exactly would it work? George, thank you.
Well, thanks, Dolly, and thanks everyone for joining. Dolly, can I thank you and all the team, and Susie and Georgie and everyone, for what I know has been an incredible few weeks. The plans for a Manchester festival were taking shape fantastically well, and then, like everyone, you've had to draw up a plan B. And I know we had plans, you had plans for the Big Tent to go digital. Maybe through this, we will at least be able to really push forward on digital democracy. And it's great to be joining you tonight to do this. And also, just in addition to your comments about the Prime Minister, I'm very conscious that as of today's figures, 6,000 people have died. And in the last 24 hours, 786 people have died. So, and I know everyone, perhaps if I speak for everyone, we will all be conscious that we speak at a time of real national emergency. And although at times the festival has been playful, I think tonight's conversation is obviously pretty serious and set against that backdrop. Yeah, look, the reason I've called for Keir Starmer, just to be clear what I have called for, called for Keir Starmer as the newly elected leader of Her Majesty's opposition, and congratulations to him on that, to be invited in to join COVID cabinet, COVID Cobra, and when appropriate, and when the PM is back, to stand shoulder to shoulder with him to support the public messaging. And the reason I call for that is threefold, really. Firstly, this is a genuinely unprecedented, extraordinary moment in our history. It may not be a war in the sense of a traditional war when we've had war cabinets before, but it's pretty clear from the Prime Minister's language and the scale of what we're dealing with that it is a very modern type of war. It's a war against an infection, against a virus, and it's triggered the suspension of many of the usual liberties, parliamentary procedures. Many of the things that we see in acute wartime have been triggered, and the scale of the economic intervention, 330 billion announced in a week, the scale of the societal impact, the scale of the suspension of liberties, I just think it demands that government and politics respond. And I don't mean a full coalition as the 2010-15 government. I'm meaning simply for the purposes of the duration of this emergency, the leader of the opposition being brought in. And second reason, I think that we are only still actually in phase one. I'm conscious in my constituency, the hospitals have been emptied in preparation for this. We're about to ask, in London already are asking, public servants to go well beyond what we normally expect of them. Many are risking their lives, and I think it's very important that many people who might not have voted for the government know that at the top of the government, the representative they did vote for has a voice. And thirdly, I think it's one of those moments where the opposition and the government should work together, which doesn't mean we suspend all scrutiny. And that's why at the same time I've suggested that Parliament should form a grand committee, all the select committee chairs, to show that good scrutiny, good accountability is continuing through Parliament. And I think that would make it easier for the opposition to join in this national effort during this national emergency.
Thank you, George. I mean, it just shows how much there is to think about in terms of all of this, and it links very nicely on to the kind of role of opposition, the right role for opposition. And I wanted to ask Emily, we now, as George is a very different opposition leader, and we have a very different shadow cabinet to match. So what should Keir be doing to create the best balance of constructive opposition without losing political independence and power, which is what George was touching on, and is this possible politically?
Thank you so much, Dolly. Thank you to George, and thank you so much for having me in this conversation. I obviously echo everything that's been said about the Prime Minister. All I can also say is that I know from first-hand experience how brilliant the care is that he's getting. My own mother suffered from this virus very badly. She was in hospital quite seriously at the beginning for over a week. The care she received was absolutely exemplary. And if there's one thing we've learned during this crisis already, is how much we owe to those people who quite literally are risking their lives to save the lives of people like the Prime Minister, my mother, and thousands of others. So he is in, as everyone is, in wonderful hands. It's often said that the leader of the opposition is the worst job in politics, and of all the times to have been appointed leader of the opposition, it's got to rank as one of the strangest and hardest. I think the response from Keir Starmer has been absolutely right. It's been sensible. It's been clear from the get-go about how he wants to engage constructively. What that means in practice is the question. And I think we've noticed how, when Parliament has not been sitting, even though it was in that kind of strange half form for its last week before it rose for Easter, you have seen how it is much harder to scrutinise effectively and ask the type of questions that members of Parliament like George need to, because they are a source of vital information from all their constituents who are asking about perhaps gaps in some of the government's safety nets. That is not by any means to say that they're intentional gaps. It's just everyone is having to work so incredibly hard and quickly to catch up to this crisis that there are naturally things that people need to think about that come up. And it is harder to do that completely digitally, not in Parliament. It's not impossible, but George's call for a virtual liaison committee, essentially, to scrutinise the government, I think is very important, because it's actually it is incredibly important that scrutiny happens in this time for the best reason. So this is not the kind of point scoring politics that we might go on to talk about later, but this is actually identifying things that need to be done in a engaging and helpful way, because actually I think everyone in politics, everyone that's interested in politics, just wants the best things to happen and is appreciative of the fact that this is going on in such a strange time. And I think, you can tell the periods in British history where the balance between opposition government has got out of kilter, in some cases quite recent history. Now is the time for that balance to go back to being what it needs to be, which is a healthy scrutiny done in the best of intentions, and that I have every confidence that the people that are now leading the opposition and the team know that.
Thank you so much, Emily. I wondered actually, George, before we sort of move on to some of the more lasting impacts in terms of implications of COVID, we've got different types of oppositions or different levels of oppositions, in the sense that we've got the oppositions between parties at a national level. But what about the sorts of accountability at an international level, with countries taking a different approach? And you must be discussing this all the time with people coming to you asking why, we're not following the German approach in terms of testing or whatever it is, and what you might comment on in terms of that accountability at the international level as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the extraordinary things about this crisis is, I mean, to just use the wartime metaphor again, it's a war in which every day the data are published internationally and everyone can see all of the data, and that in itself is unusual. It triggers a lot of armchair commentary, but it does dramatically raise the bar on accountability. So, as you say, Dolly, not only in the UK are ministers having to account for decisions, but their comparative data with all the other countries, which is it's an extra level of scrutiny and demand. And ministers will be aware that there is a public debate going on about, why in Japan and the Far East, South Korea, they've seemingly got on top of this better, why Germany seems to have contained it better than France, and all of that. And as the two big decisions which loom are confronted by the cabinet, firstly, whether to extend the lockdown, and then at what point and on what basis it might be appropriate to start to ease it. I'm sure they will be looking at those comparative data and both the facts of why, and obviously testing has been key to that, but also what the data coming from those countries shows is a new virus, and it, the epidemiology is being shaped every day. I mean, I think the principal benefit of having the leader of the opposition in the cabinet and in the Cobra briefings is that, I mean, I think it's a risk, obviously, for both parties, for the Prime Minister and for the government. It's a risk to give your opponent, bring them in and give them the benefit of high office and all the rest of it on sort of normal political metrics. My argument is actually, I think the public want to see people pulling together, and the leader of the opposition is supposed to be prepared for office and government. It's just unusual in the last 2 or 3 years we've had someone that I would argue hasn't been, but we do have somebody now who is of a much higher stature. But also for Keir Starmer, I think it is clear that there will have to be a kind of debate after this about lessons learned, mistakes made, and he will obviously want to reserve his right to comment at the time. But I think there's an argument for him to be able to be at the heart of the decision-making process now, not least to reassure people, the political pressure is going to go up, and people are going to start to say, well, why should I go to work if I haven't got proper PPE? We're already seeing in my constituency, people not in the health service actually, but in other public services, asking whether that's fair. And I think it'll be quite important that they can see that the leader of the opposition, the leader of the Labour Party, just as Attlee did in the war, is standing shoulder to shoulder and making clear that this is a national effort. And I think it can be done in a way that the debate that will follow about lessons to be learnt can be done by both parties, if you like, in a spirit of normal politics. And I think later in the call, we're going to talk about my suggestion of a commission, Dolly. And and the possible role that the Big Tent might play in shaping that debate about the lessons learned.
Thank you so much, Emily. I wanted to bring you in and to comment on that.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between George's call for briefings and knowledge to be able to inform better scrutiny and actually taking part in a cabinet and therefore being responsible as part of collective responsibility for the actions of the government, which is, I think, a more difficult ask for an opposition, A, that's only 2 days old, and B, has been thrust into the middle of a crisis, therefore without the kind of necessary knowledge of how government works that their counterparts who are actual ministers with everything that comes with that have. I think that's of a harder political choice, not least because later on down the line, as in the many public inquiries that will come out of this, it will be harder. It's only been, as I say, 2 days, and also it makes the job of public scrutiny accountability, I think, a little bit harder for the opposition if they are actively being involved in the discussions. In terms of public messaging and key core themes that every responsible person should be out there and saying, absolutely. In terms of briefing, so the knowledge is there, so they're not asking pointless questions that actually then just cause more stress and strain. And press stories, many press have been completely responsible, some slightly, I'd say, irresponsible in some of the reporting at times. So that there's that factor too. So I think there are degrees of this, but a kind of full wartime-esque coalition that I don't think the politics make sense now, and it's going to last a long time, this, but I don't think it makes sense on a longer term basis either.
I'm being very cheeky and asking your opinion, given it's so recent, but there's been quite little chat in comparison to what it would have been, I imagine, without this current situation. But what are your reflections on what we are to expect from this new Labour Party, new Labour leadership?
Well, it is a new generation. There are some incredibly impressive people that have been who haven't had their time in the last few years for a number of issues. I don't think it's any surprise to say the Labour Party has had a few internal issues over the past few years. They are, I think, completely aware of their responsibilities, not least at this time of crisis. I think that it is a reflection of the mainstream of the Labour Party as it exists now, as much as you can get a view of what the mainstream Labour Party is now, but it was won quite comprehensively by Keir Starmer. I think that being so conscious of the situation you're in, it is completely natural that they're going to want to be as serious and constructive with their opposite numbers, conscious of the role they have to play with the public. But it is a different Labour Party than the last 4 years, and you'll see that on, whether it's social or traditional media, the type of outriders that you had seen constantly for the last few years, that this is not that type of politics. So I think the nature of the public debate will change, because the people in the political traditions that are now represented in the shadow cabinet, they are just very different from the last ones. And I can only speak personally as someone that had some cultural trouble within the Labour Party in the last few years. This is on the face of it, at least, one hopes, not the type of group of people with the type of approach to political culture, i.e. much more inclusive and not so much you're either with us or against us, that can allow a bit more of the type of politics and the type of political culture that we will be discussing for the next few moments constructively.
Thank you. And I saw recently that he'd met with leaders of the Jewish sectors, and that was an indication of just how easy it can be to break some of the difficulties that have been kind of defining of the Labour Party over the past couple of years. So but kind of moving on and thinking more about the possible lasting impact of COVID on politics in particular, it's sort of easy to say everything will change for the better or nothing will be the same again. And while that's clearly over dramatic, Benn recently said that an unprecedented crisis like this will likely accelerate changes that were already in motion, not necessarily changing anything in and of itself. So I wanted to put this question to you both on how you think the experience of these few months will impact our political culture, and really thinking about dynamics like the experts versus populism, which is happening. Has the crisis rehabilitated the reputation of experts, as we apparently are seeing with these daily briefings, for example, or is an economic crisis fertile ground for neo-populism, nationalism, and more? So to George first.
Yeah, sorry, I just dropped off there. I'm back. Look, I think I think you're dead right. There are some very big political, economic, and social implications of this. It's a bit early, perhaps, to know exactly what they are, but it's not too early to start to ask. It seems to me on the political side, as you say, I think there's a kind of recognition of big government and the role of government at a time like this. Some might comment on the irony of a conservative government that has prided itself, in its rhetoric at least, on sort of being contemptuous of some of the things Jeremy Corbyn was suggesting, and now found itself having to take powers far beyond any that he'd suggested. But so I think there's a kind of rediscovery of, golly, when you need government, you really need it, and it works. And I think there's as we've discussed, the kind of sense that there's a limit to partisan politics, and people want a line beyond which people come together and just put the national interest first. And I think that sense of a line won't disappear after this. And also politically, I think it'll become clearer that scrutiny has a role, good scrutiny. We've just been talking about it. And hopefully that means that Parliament will both sort of rediscover its mojo a bit, and public trust and support in parliamentary scrutiny after the Brexit sort of sagas. But also, I think politically and socially, economically and socially. I mean, economically, this is going to leave the Treasury with a huge headache, debt to GDP ratio that we haven't seen since the war. I can imagine, that the traditional orthodoxy in the Treasury will be, to get out of this debt trap, we've got to raise tax, reduce spending. But I don't imagine there's going to be any great political appetite for austerity 2.0. So there's a huge economic issue for the UK. How are we going to get rid of this debt so that the new generation aren't saddled with it? And to me, that means inflation is likely to go up, and there are going to have to be some quite big conversations about writing off debt in a fair way. And also globally, I think one's got to assume this is going to accelerate the shift of power to the East. And this is going to hit the West harder, not just because of the fact that most of the PPE is made in China, and they got on top of it in a way that a non-democracy can, and all of that, but also the Northern European economies with higher elderly, more people on welfare, more people kept alive and supported with comorbidities in more sophisticated health systems. It's going to leave us with a bigger debt, bigger gap in our economies. I mean, 10 million unemployed in America in 3 weeks is extraordinary. So I think both economically, internationally, as well as domestically, huge implications which will need to be discussed at some point in the autumn. And then societally, I think interested to know, Emily, what you make of this. But I think, Dolly, there's a sense that, I don't know, that in my street lockdown in London, people are genuinely, talking to each other, knocking on doors, discovering each other. We're going to have a street party. People who've walked past each other for years on their way to busy lives are chatting. And it's not just, sort of middle-class people over Darjeeling, while the people in the housing estates are on their own. We've got a very tough old estate round the corner, and everyone's talking and stopping and chatting. And that rediscovery of community, I think, won't go away. People will want to try and hold on to it. This sort of digital interaction, I think a lot of people are realizing, guess what? You can run a business in a moth-eaten old shirt from home. And I think a lot of people are going to start to want to be more flexible. Public services are discovering, finally, the power of digital. In Norfolk, we've got the hospital 60% vacancy in the hospital in 3 weeks. The traditional gap between social care and NHS with bed blocking has just been sorted in 3 weeks. Amazing. And in the same way that the Ebola and Zika crises led to huge accelerations in how we develop drugs, there will be some powerful and positive impacts of this. And I think harnessing some of those it would be a powerful part of a good legacy as well, and perhaps the Big Tent might play a role in that.
Emily?
First thing I'd say is that it's not going to get rid of partisan politics, and you don't want it to get rid of partisan politics, because disagreement and difference of opinion are good. I think you can slightly fall into the trap of saying, oh, we're all just going to get on and just do quote unquote the right thing. Well, there are differences of opinion on it, and there always will be, and you want those differences of opinion. And you know, if I think back to the previous question, and actually very relevant to this about the role of experts and how we're relying on Sir Chris Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance and our medical experts, you also need politicians and politics to make the decisions, because you know, science alone is not going to give you the answer. You cannot run a government just on expert opinion. You need a political force, you need a political agenda and a political decision-making process that's going to survive this too. And there are a few ways, I think, culturally in politics that this hopefully will make some changes that were kind of far long overdue. And there are plenty of people that had lots of problems with the political culture before that hopefully will have some comfort in the way that some things have changed. Let's talk about collaboration versus point scoring. No needless press releases that I could tell you what it was going to say anyway. This is another disgraceful attempt of the government's attempt to XYZ. They lose their potency. They've lost their meaning, because it's just so predictable and boring and has no impact on anyone, because it's not actually providing a solution or engaging or even scrutinizing in a constructive way. So there's the collaboration / point scoring bit. I think the other thing this crisis hopefully has shown is that you can't just hope that these problems won't come and avoid them. You know, you actually have to plan for these scenarios, and there are long-term issues that this country and many countries have been completely avoiding. George talked about aging and social care. This is something that I spent a couple of years researching. You know, our social care system is just not fit for purpose, and is certainly not fit for purpose if you look at the aging demographic profile that we have. The way it's funded by local councils, well, it's the local councils in the most deprived areas that have A, the least ability to raise their own revenue, and B, the highest demand for their services. It doesn't work. And this is something that's been put off for years. I mean, before I could even vote in general elections, they were talking about how you need to change social care, and I've just voted in whatever, my 5th general election in some ludicrously short space of time. So how about our ageing society social care system being one? Our tax system, well, it needed to be changed anyway, and my word, as George demonstrated, you're going to have to find a way of changing our tax system now to pay back the understandable amount of money that is having to be used now to support. And how do you do that without pushing pressure on the generational inequalities that are already massive in our tax and welfare system? If you look at the inheritance profile and the inheritance boom that some people are going to get coming up, and the huge amount of people are not, how are you going to deal with that wealth gap that's already going in one direction? How are you going to deal with a really quite precarious employment situation? I mean, if you look at how the distribution of people who've been most affected by the kind of shutdown and furloughs, it's young people, it's people on insecure employment anyway, it's people on low incomes, people with no savings. These are huge challenges that things have been tried to be done by various politics, but you can't avoid them anymore, because just like you'd hope a pandemic wouldn't come, unfortunately it has. These things are, I know they're going to affect us. So stop burying your head in the sand. And that's not to say there's only one answer and everyone just needs to get together and agree, because that's not how life works. That's not how politics really works. But you do have to have a much better system of trying to get to some answer. And I guess the last thing I'd say about how I hope politics might change is the kind of honesty versus false promises thing, because you know, people aren't stupid. When I was campaigning as a candidate, you know, if I said something that as a kind of promise, you know, so many people you campaign with would just say, well, we just know that's not possible, and they're not wrong. And people aren't stupid. They know when what you're saying is not true. And if you're going to promise people something and consistently fail to deliver, and knowing full well that you're promising something that's not possible, whether you're talking about the number of tests that can be done in this crisis or whatever it is, you have to start being honest with people and give them the respect that they deserve, which is talk to them about the challenges. You know, it is very difficult in the climate and media, and certainly social media climate that we live in, because you're pounced on the minute you do anything. But, you know, can't we get to a point, and I don't have the answer all of as to how, where the difficulties and challenges are to be talked about openly, not pretended that they aren't there.
I mean, this is so fascinating and kind of in terms of especially the role that some organizations like Big Tent can play, because we are constantly, when we're hosting sessions at the festival every year, trying to get the answers to that how question, which you've just put so brilliantly across on, you know, the major questions being the how. So I'm going to throw your own questions back at you. I'm going to redirect them, I should say, boomerang them to George, because the how question is the most important. You know, we know what these problems are. We know we want to move to a more collaborative politics, but how? And I think I'm caveating that because it is such a hard question with the question of where, can you think of a time pre-COVID of a kind of success example of where you've seen it work in practice without having to have a pandemic spur it on? So is there a reference point of success, and how do we replicate it going forward?
Well, a couple of thoughts on that. It would be interesting to get the participants in the call to get people's insights on that, but I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, the obvious one, I think, going back a bit is, you know, I use the wartime metaphor, and the work that Beveridge and Butler did behind Attlee and Churchill in the second half of the war to think about, or to understand initially that the world would look very different and should look very different. Now, I mean, this isn't on the scale of the Second World War. I don't want to get it out of proportion. You know, 450,000 people from Britain died and 44 million in the world. It's not on that scale. But that idea of anticipating the world after and thinking before you've got there about what things one might want to change, I think is really valid. And they did it successfully. And there have been other kind of commissions, the Gro-Harlem-Brundtland Commission, the Stern Commission. I mean, there have been good sort of commissions that have framed that debate. And it's one of the things Sally, as co-trustee of the Big Tent, Sally Morgan and I have been thinking about is, you know, whether the Big Tent might help to frame a sort of autumn 2020 lessons, a policy agenda. But the other thing I'd say, Dolly, and Emily, it'd be interesting to get your take on this. One of the things I've noticed is that, I mean, as a localist in politics, I think the British state is massively over-centralised, and I think that's part of the crisis in our political economy. I can't help but observe that in this crisis, yes, government ministers have made big announcements, but actually the vast majority of the real delivery work is being done locally. And my local authorities, district councils, county councils, working together with a pace and an urgency and a sort of teamwork ethos that we haven't seen for years. And I think, I mean, you talk about health and social care. Again, in Norfolk, the first county that'll have more pensioners than non-pensioners. It is our number one issue. And when I see our hospitals clear people out and put them into community care at speed properly, and I start to think, golly, if we could harness some of that local community-based purposive leadership and government as a result of this, that would be something. And I think a lot of people in the next few weeks are going to see this crisis go from London and Downing Street to their own town hall and their own communities, and they'll see the power of local government. And I hope that one of the legacies might be that people want to keep that sense that in their own locality, they can shape their own destiny.
Thank you, George. Emily, do you want to come back on that? And I also wonder whether you could comment particularly on the role of organisations like Big Tent to fill this gap, because we're so able in terms of our purpose being exactly this. What should we be doing? And to comment also back onto what George was saying.
Yeah, I'll definitely want to talk about how organisations can help do this. Just to George's point, I always have, sometimes it's quite a controversial view, but I am always sceptical when people talk about quote unquote devolution to just mean local councils, because when I was a local councillor, I found people in my ward who were as turned off by what they saw as town hall politics as they were by Westminster politics. It doesn't automatically mean when you're devolving power to local authorities that somehow it's going to be responsive and people are going to be able to feel automatically part of a way of taking control back over their own lives, and their frustrations seem to be more directed at local politics than they were national. What you just outlined was a better way of working, a more efficient way of working, full stop. And this is a problem that lots of local authorities have had. It's not unique to local authorities. Every time I speak to loads of private sector businesses when trying to sort out a problem, I can't quite understand how incompetent some of the processes seem to be. This is unfortunately a harder problem about how you harness people to work better, to engage better, to involve people better, to feel like their ideas can be utilised, and that's quite a hard problem. I don't want to sound too pessimistic about it, but there's more to it than just doing it locally. And how you get people to actually feel, on the one hand, like their views and their hopes and what they think needs to happen immediately, and you combine that with a representative democracy system where you elect people to try and make decisions for you, and so people that have got so much on with their lives just need to get on with it and hope that people that they elect will be able to do what they need to do. These are all actually a bit harder questions, but better efficient systems to get stuff done quickly, that's the kind of holy grail that it's hard, and I could spend hours talking about it, so I won't, because I'll bore you. The point about how organisations can help, firstly, I think a network like for example the Big Tent can use its influence and power to shine a light on those examples where people are doing amazing things. So take it to places that no one would never have heard of, and get the people that are doing wonderful things to be part of it and talk about how it's worked. Because I don't know about you, I try not to watch the news 24 hours at the moment because I just can't cope, but it's those examples of organisations or individuals that are doing wonderful things. They're the things that give me hope, it's the things that keep me going, and it's the things that inspire me that things can be done better. So firstly, it's going out and finding those people and bringing them in a way that they wouldn't otherwise have done. It's somehow running a campaign of empathy, because I think empathy is just the most important kind of emotion when you're thinking about this, because for every wonderful person that we've seen doing something great, people can be quite quick to judge. They can not try and think about the other person's opinion. If you go on, again, social media, the amount of people that seem to be in a park taking photos of other people in a park and saying, how dare they be there when they themselves are in a park. People can sometimes not have that kind of, how are you really thinking? People like the Big Tent, the ability to get those people together in a way that they can actually talk and empathize. Anything that can do that, I think, is super important. And I think the other way that organizations can do it is by reminding everyone that, unlike pretty much anything I can think of in my living memory, everyone has sacrificed something in this. It's that spirit of shared experience that by quite literally getting people together in different places, people will realize that it may be in slightly different ways, but everyone has had to play a part in this. And you have to somehow try and lead a kind of national conversation. And I know George will want to talk about his plans for a kind of new beverage. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but somehow you have to do that by bringing people along. And all I can say is that I used to have quite difficult conversations with people on doorsteps when I was trying to get them to vote for me, because they would say, oh, well, I want it this way and I vote for you and it won't happen that way. There's also that balance between people being involved doesn't mean that everything they want is going to happen. And you have to be honest with people about that. But people have to have their say. And it's the job of organisations like this and others to make sure it's the people that have had the most incredible experiences doing the amazing things are the ones that we can shine a light on, so their say is not missed.
Thank you so much. I actually wanted to bring in some of the audience at the moment. We're almost at 10 past anyway, but Michael, we are happy to ask your question, and please do. It's a fascinating one on the economy and health balance. So if Michael is able to ask his question, otherwise I will ask it for him. Michael.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, brilliant.
Yes, hi. I just was asking, with regard to the exit from lockdown, there's talk of friction between Rishi Sunak and Matt Hancock. Economy and health balance, if you like. Given this balance, what could and should an exit look like?
Please introduce yourself before, should have said that before, and say who you would like to answer your question.
Oh, okay. I'm Michael Holland. I'm a retired entrepreneur, and I'm directing this to George.
Thank you.
Great. Well, it's the key question, Michael. I don't think there's a sort of personal Rishi Matt Hancock issue. It's what one would expect. There's a legitimate tension, I think, that's got to be resolved in cabinet between, on the one hand, the view that says the primacy of of protecting the NHS's capacity must be sustained, and this whole strategy has been based on making sure we try and flatten the curve and make sure we don't have a situation where people are needing care in the NHS which it hasn't got the capacity to give. Once, but we're paying a huge price for that. The economic impact of this is horrendous, and it's clear to me that obviously the media has covered the sort of the daily drama of the death numbers, understandably, and the infection rates, but behind the scenes in the SME sector there is a huge problem with a lot of businesses really struggling. And I fear one of the legacies of this, by the way, in constituencies like mine, will be many of those businesses on the high streets of old market towns will pack up and go. I was talking to a butcher yesterday. He's been going for 40 years. It's been tough in the last, and he said, I just can't see it, George. I can't survive. And you can't see his children starting it after he's closed. And so I think there's a genuine debate in cabinet, which will be about at what point is it right to start to ease the lockdown to allow the economy to recover a bit and people to get out without compromising public health and safety. And my instinct is that there are two preconditions for that. One is we need to see, or the cabinet, I think, would need to see the curve, the sort of NHS curve just beginning to turn. It doesn't have to be steep, but it needs to be a consistent decline in pressure on the NHS. And secondly, I think, if I read it right, that they would need to see much greater access to testing so that it can be an intelligent and test-led lockdown release. But it is true, I think, that at the moment, the public health officials, the NHS, are very and understandably cautious of any debate about this because of the risk that with a sunny bank holiday coming, it might make people think, oh, well, if the government's going to be easing the lockdown, then it probably doesn't matter too much. Whereas, in fact, compliance with lockdown is the key to making sure that we might get to the point where we can ease it off more quickly. So I think there's a genuine and very difficult debate to be had in cabinet in a few weeks about at what point is it appropriate to ease off.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Michael, for that question. I wanted to bring in Mark Essex, if you're happy to say your question, because it links so brilliantly with the question that we were sort of moving towards, which was about George's point on a post-COVID commission. So Mark, if you can ask your question, introduce yourself, and I'm putting this to George, and then we'll go to some questions for Emily as well. And I also note that no women are asking questions, so I'm going to ask the women watching to put some questions forward as well. Thank you.
Hello. Yes, hi, I'm Mark Essex. I work at KPMG. I'm a bit of a think tank of one, is the easiest way to describe it. And my job in the COVID crisis is to be the one person thinking about stuff that isn't working capital and cash flow, but actually start thinking about life after it. It's a bit uncomfortable at times. So I'm exclusively thinking about the back end of the year. And, I'm thinking about what enormous changes, what unthinkably big things could we contemplate on the basis of the crisis? What are the opportunities? If we think about what you say, George, 1940s moment, 1970s moment, well, we're definitely there. So if we're never going to approach Lord's reform, social care, wealth taxes, generational fairness, which of those do you think this gives us a window to address? And that's to both
Great question. I think for me that there are two that really stand out. One is social care, and the very, very big challenge in the in tray of successive governments that's really never been properly gripped, which is, and Emily expanded on this earlier, in most communities, cities, counties, you know, the NHS is paid for through central funding, the NHS from DH, and care provided by the local authority, and it's always been the poor relation. And add on top of that the dysfunctional effect of a health funding system in which basically hospitals are rewarded for being full. It's not surprising that you've got in my county and many others a situation where the hospitals are all, guess what, full, and the care homes are, guess what, underfunded, and those two reinforce each other. And I think the effect of cities and counties having to really grip strategic health and care integration for this crisis must, and I hope will, trigger a much deeper conversation and finally gripping the issue of proper care and proper integration. And for me, the principles of that would be integration, localization, and incentivization. And actually that takes you into some of the finance, I think, because if we fund social care properly, I don't think there's anyone in the country who seriously thinks that there won't have to be a property contribution to that. How you do it, I think, is the problem. And the last Conservative manifesto in 2017, I think, made the fatal mistake of suggesting it should be done wholly from London on some pretty simple metrics, whereas I would argue the opposite, that it's probably better done by democratic local accountability. Most people I know who have elderly parents who are in their own home but worried and having to think about going into care, on the one hand, they might be thinking, well, I'm going to inherit a third or a quarter of parents' house. On the other hand, I'm going to inherit a third or a quarter of the liability of looking after them. These are two sides of the same coin for people and for families, just as they are for communities. I think if people felt that some element of property tax was going into paying for the care of the people in the property, ring-fenced, not just going down to London to be spent on HS2 or whatever scheme the government of the day had, I think there'd be more confidence in it. So that's my first one. And the second one is, I think this redistribution of tax and debt between the generations, it was a massive issue after the crash. You know, effectively, those people under 40 in this country have inherited the debt. Anyone who owned assets in this country, mainly people over 40 at the time, benefited massively from QE. And that intergenerational injustice, I think, was sort of compounded and partly explained the Brexit generational divide. And if we didn't grip it then, I think we're going to have to grip it now. You can't saddle an economy with this level of debt without having a debate about who pays it off and how. So those are my two things: care and intergenerational debt transfer.
If I could just add, having, as I said earlier, aging societies is something I've become arguably a bit obsessed with, having been studying it for a couple of years. But aging societies, everyone automatically and quite understandably thinks about care and paying for people in their old age when they need care. Our aging demographic profile affects everything in a way that you can sometimes forget. It affects our education system. Does it make sense that you go off to university at 18 to 21 and then don't have a system of formal or informal education really for the rest of your life, given the changing profile? Arguably not. What do you do about people that don't want to retire at a traditional age? Are they blocking people from earlier in their careers? How do you resolve that tension? What do you do about health inequalities? You know, from where I'm sitting in South London, I can walk in a half an hour maybe, and in two opposing wards there'll be a 15-year life expectancy gap, and more in healthy life expectancy, which is the actual quality of life, not just how long you're actually alive. These are issues about education, these are issues about access to proper housing. It is everything. How are you going to cope with the way that the labour market is changing with the advent of technology and AI? Are you seeing a hollowing out, as some are predicting and arguing is already happening, a hollowing out of the middle and more low-paid, insecure jobs in care, retail, hospitality, etc., a knowledge economy at the top, and a whole gap in the middle? How are you going to cope with that? So these are things that have been a problem for ages, and you know, friends of mine will say I bored them by saying we need a kind of new settlement, new beverage, whatever you want to call it. What are our big 5 roads on the way to reconstruction, in the same way that he asked in 1941? You've got the environmental crisis that you certainly can't ignore. And the other thing I'd say about employment insecurity is that, you know, what I have found so difficult for so many, you know, friends even I know, is that the employment situations turned out to be so much more precarious. And as someone who cares about the arts and musical and theatre institutions, it's just completely devastating, this period. And how you get back, it's very difficult to just put those kind of sectors on ice and expect them to just suddenly magically reappear. It's really, really tough. And there are still some serious gaps in the provision and support that this government has already announced in wonderful ways for other sectors, but there's a lot of gaps that are going to be very, very, very hard for the people that are falling through them.
Thank you so much. And you touched upon the inequality point, which links perfectly to one of the private questions I've got. So I will read that out, but if the person who asked it actually does want to enter into the conversation, then please do, and please comment as well if you feel that you've got the background area or interest or whatever to participate in this. So the question is, the government's priority is rightly to the health of its own citizens and economy, but what is the UK's role in the international community to make sure a larger humanitarian crisis in developing countries is averted, one that will harm the UK's interests in the long term, driving poverty, insecurity, migration? So talk about the inequality element, the poverty element, and international perspective.
Good one. Yeah, so I think one of the implications of this, one of the legacies, will be a much greater recognition of biosecurity as a global issue, human, plant, animal health, and the risks of infectious disease in a globalized economy. And antibiotic resistance will be another thing that the world is going to have to really think hard about. And I think one of the legacies is that people will realize we really don't have adequate global institutions capable of providing the leadership that's required. But more specifically on that point about international development, I think one of the things that we will, and we should have been doing anyway, but hopefully this will spur it, look at is whether we can't use our science base in the UK to better support global resilience in terms of infectious disease and biosecurity. So for example, an idea that I proposed when I was Minister for Life Science, if you look at somewhere like Porton Down in the UK, which was our old sort of NBC Cold War nuclear biological chemical research lab. Public Health England, interestingly, were headquartered there in Wiltshire. We moved them at their request from Wiltshire to Harlow to be closer to the sort of Cambridge-Stevenage cluster. And in that windy campus there's a whole bunch of sort of Nissan huts and some virologists and some secret squirrel science, and a little company called Porton Biopharma, who was owned by Public Health England. They're a global leader actually in vaccine science. Imagine if we invested in Porton Down as a global biosecurity campus, recapitalised Porton Pharma properly, created a global vaccines business, linked it to Jenner and the Oxford University Institute. Excuse me. I think we could then use our aid budget to make the UK a much more active global leader in the science and technology of plant, animal and human health. And that would be a win-win. Good business for us, good for our research economy, and good for global development. We can't afford in the next few decades to have repeated examples of epidemics, pandemics like this. And we're going to have to find a way to deal with it commercially.
Thank you so much, George. I wanted to touch upon one of Tim's points about engaging a large group of the population that demands to be heard but doesn't want to be listened. Tim, please feel free to sort of say your point. And I wondered whether we could link it with Emily to a point on going digital, the fact that we are all going digital. And in terms of engaging and having the opportunities to engage with people in a way that we probably never could have imagined before, and in terms of an acceleration process, my word, this is one. But in terms of electronic voting systems, interactive parliament, you know, how to deal with the local government side of things. So Tim, firstly, if you're able and willing and around, and then to Emily.
So very briefly, my point was just that we still seem to have a large proportion of the population that we can't really engage with very well, who are very happy to follow things on social media and so on. But my experience of, like Emily's, knocking on doors in general elections when I was a candidate, last time against Keir Starmer, funnily enough, or as a councillor, is that you knock on doors and they say something and you say, oh, well, would like to explain it like this, like that. Then you go confusing me. I don't need to know that. I'm telling you what I think. If you don't like it, we'll vote for someone else. And in the same way, they don't want to listen. So they end up sunbathing or cycling around Richmond Park clad in lycra. This isn't necessarily a class point or an education point. There is a strand that goes through the population that no longer wants to listen or necessarily engage. How do we reach them, given that this crisis is proving that it is not sufficient, given everything else is going on, because they're still acting like complete muppets, and we need to find a way of cutting through to that.
Well, I guess firstly I'd say is hopefully the number of complete muppets, to use your phrase, is much lower than some people would have you think. Secondly, as annoying as it is, there'll be some people that just never want to engage about anything, and you just have to accept it. You're not going to get through to all the people, and you know, that's life. I've got people I know that are completely bloody impossible. I've given up trying to change them in any way, shape or form. As my mother always said, never marry a man you want to change. I've tried to have a kind of take that approach to some aspects of difficult conversations. I guess the only other thing I'd say is that it's kind of what I was trying to get at with my point about representative democracy. Though, you know, there are a whole bunch of people. It's very easy to overstate how much lots of people care about politics or think about it all the time. There's enough trying to get on with life admin, you name it. It's difficult, and that's partly why, quite understandably, they say, well, hang on, we elected you to go off and do a job. You said you do this. Why don't you just go off and do it? It's a perfectly valid and perfectly reasonable point. So notwithstanding the people that you're never going to get at, and the people that understandably that have essentially delegated, there are totally ways to get it at people. And one hopes that the experience that we're having in now, where everyone has had to have this kind of shared experience of self-sacrifice in a way that, as I said earlier, I think is very, very different to anything I can ever think of. And you talk about, it's not just people in Britain, going back to the international point, all my family all over the world, it's bizarre speaking to them, and we're all having this kind of same experience. It's just weird. Even in a war, you don't have this same level of restriction that's so the same everywhere. So you kind of have to harness somehow that approach, and there are ways of doing it digitally. And you know, someone who is living on my own at the moment, I'm living through digital communication, and I think there will be a lot of people that, if this goes on a few more weeks like this, you know, they're going to want to talk about issues that are not just the day-to-day crisis and the day-to-day challenge, because you know, at some point you start to hope about life again and normal life again, and how you don't want it to be quite the same as what it was. So I hope that organizations like this and everyone, we all need advice about how to do it, can help foster a spirit of understanding and changing people's minds. But the only way you do that is by individually getting people you know that want to be involved. Like, this is not something that some organization can magically do. It relies on the people that are supporting it, and it relies on the people that are interested in it to bring people in, and it relies on people's ideas about how the best way is to do that. So I'm always wary of saying any one thing or any one group will be able to do it, because that's just rubbish. Anything is built on the success of the ability of people to do it. And you all know your friends, you all know the people around you that you think would be interested and willing to change their mind in the right circumstance and in the right way. That's what we're going to rely on.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm going to try, we've got 2 minutes. I'm going to try and squeeze in the last 2 questions. So if I can bring in Julian to introduce himself and ask his question on government support to businesses, or I can ask it if you don't want to, but please come in. And if I can direct that to George, and 30 seconds answer, and then one for Emily after that. So Julian first, if we can keep it, the answers as short as possible.
Hi, George, Executive Chairman of a tech startup business. So government support to businesses won't work for the startup and scale up tech businesses, because banks, even with the 80% government guarantee, are not going to lend to businesses that aren't yet profitable. How can we change that? Because otherwise we're going to lose much of our tech sector, and that's an important area for our future economy. Lots of businesses, their future delayed, don't have the funding.
It's a brilliant point. I've just raised it, I said just last week, with Robert Jenrick and with Rishi. They are aware of it. I think they, in the Treasury, it's very easy to think that all businesses are sort of FTSE 200 businesses that are ready and we've got the systems to liaise and work with the bank. And actually banks are not, certainly in my part of the world, they're not well set up. They're basically tuned after the crash to computer says no. And a lot of businesses that need the money are not qualifying. It's a real problem. Happy to take it with you offline, actually.
Thank you very much. And the final one was sent to me privately, so I'll read it out very quickly. And for Emily, you have sub 30 seconds to go. But maybe just a thought, and if we can continue this also on the website, that of accountability and scrutiny to the media itself, of being responsible and reporting responsibly. How do you think that they have conducted themselves as a sector over this COVID period, and what should we be looking out for going forward?
I think that there's an understandable rush to every day it's a new figure, you're just focused on the day-to-day. What I hope that a kind of media culture might start to promote a bit more is thinking about the long-term questions that we've just talked about. And I hope that, in a bit like the way I talked about political culture changing to get away from the point scoring, also the kind of gotcha culture that we live in, the minute you make a mistake, it's over. You know, whatever happened to is human, and to forgive divine. We have to somehow find a way of accountability and scrutiny without gotcha, and the minute you make a mistake, it's kind of over. Because that doesn't lead to good decision making. You're so panicked about the next headline that come every 30 seconds if you follow Twitter all the time, all day, which is not, by the way, I think, a particularly healthy way of spending this quarantine period. You just don't make good decisions. You don't involve the right people because your priority is the wrong priority. So I hope that a longer term culture could be fostered, and one where you're not going to agree with everything, you can attack as much as you can, but do it in a way that's constructive. And that, I hopefully, is a message that applies to everything we've talked about today, applies to the mission of the Big Tent, which is to do it in a way where you can challenge people to change their mind, but in a friendly and constructive way, and for the right values and the right reasons.
Thank you so much. A perfect note to end, and apologies, 2 minutes over with my OCD. That is unforgivable, but I hope you will. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all for spending your early Tuesday evening with us for our first Big Tent Digital event, the first of many, and you will be getting notified of those coming up over the coming weeks. To our brilliant speakers, Emily, George, thank you so much, and also huge thanks to the team as well for making this happen in such a short space of time. We very much hope you all enjoyed the discussion. As I said earlier, we will have this open for another hour, so please continue chatting. You can in fact raise your hand in the participant or participation part of the Zoom screen to indicate if you would like to do so. And otherwise, I look forward to seeing you virtually